Hello and welcome back to Parley. This one is sponsored by PistilWhip. Hope you'll enjoy listening. Let's see what they have to say. It's about in the intersection of fact and opinion. PistilWhip says last minute August Parley on the subject of facts, opinions, and the intersections thereof. The included image is from a Bloodborne comic that has the rather spicy take that an opinion is a, quote, idea that deforms itself into thinking it's a fact, unquote. The nature of information and information processing came up in a different context back during October's Parley on the nature of conspiracy theories. In that discussion, I suggested that facts arise from observations, that they are statements of what is rather than why something is or how something is. We'll come back to the comic a little later. That is to say, it is possible to make an observation and be wrong about what you observed. One example that comes to mind from an Adam Ragusa video is that throwing salt into boiling water makes it appear to boil harder. The viewer in question then concluded that the salt must be making the water hotter, which Adam then disproved. The observation of the bubbling water is a fact, separate from an explanation of why it boiled. From Captain's Own streams, we've had occasions of observing phenomena in games, for example, a unit demonstrably underperforming compared to other units, and drawing different conclusions about the designers from those observations. A preponderance of evidence, observations, can support one conclusion more than another, but those conclusions are ultimately separate from the observations themselves. So to my mind, the claim that an idea can deform itself into thinking it's a fact is, well, it doesn't quite line up with the definition of a fact as outlined previously. An idea that purports to be an observation seems to me as nothing more than a fantasy, a figment of imagination, but somehow construing opinions as imagination doesn't quite sit right with me. I don't really have much direction to this Parley. This was just me rambling late at night and getting lost on tangents, as is my wont. Many good Parleys have been made a similar way. Let's just briefly read the whole comic. The Bloodborne hunter person, I don't really recall the lore of Bloodborne, says, "What is your opinion, child?" And the child says, "What is an opinion?" And the Bloodborne guy says, "An idea that deforms itself into thinking it's a fact." I think that the fun place to start, maybe, is to explore why this comic, what's going on here. This way of saying that spicy take about facts, to me, kind of says two things. One of them is this Bloodborne person has experienced a lot of people who have, like, not very valid opinions. And two, they think that is wrong, or those are bad opinions, or not particularly valid. Is it a joke? Maybe not exactly, but I would suggest that this is, I haven't read the comic and you probably have, so I don't know, but I'm gonna suggest that maybe this way of saying it indicates some awareness that that isn't like an effective form of an opinion or whatever. It's just something that is common. Maybe this character has experienced a lot of people that communicated like that before. And so have I. So let's organize a little bit. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about the mechanics of people thinking things for reasons shortly. And then also talk about what good opinions are. What good are opinions? What good, I'm just going to write what good opinions. That wasn't in my notes before this point, so let's add that in. And that'll be 2-ish sections. We'll see what happens. But first, the mechanics of what is this world where people have opinions that are ideas that deform themselves into thinking they're facts? The idea thing really sticks with me, but I really like the way that you constructed the kind of layers of forming a conclusion, PistilWhip. So we have observations and then a conclusion, and there's some kind of connecting reasoning between the two. So, for example, in the Adam Ragusa salt situation, as a bit of background, you know that if a water has a lot of salt in it, a water has a lot of salt in it. Very salty water can boil hotter. Now, it has to be very salty for that to make any like real meaningful difference. And of course, the salt has to like be dissolved and stuff. So if I have a pot of non-salted boiling water and I toss some salt in, it will, bubble up a lot. And you can see why maybe somebody would think, well, water does kind of do that when it boils, and salt does make water boil at a higher temperature. So that's the water getting hotter, right? Of course, if you know some chemistry, you might know that to dissolve the salt in the water, some chemical reactions have to occur that take energy. And so already, I don't know. And of course, the other thing to conclude is that, well, the salt is forming nucleation sites for bubbles. If you've made like a lot of drinks, for example, you'll be familiar that having stuff in the solution makes like carbonation, for example, come out more. And what are the bubbles other than, air and stuff coming out of the water? I actually don't know for sure if that's true, but anyway, whatever, it'll form more bubbles. And that is the scientifically, that is the correct answer. The salt is forming nucleation sites for the boiling water. It's not like because it's getting hotter. And even putting a ton of salt in the water doesn't make it boil at a meaningfully higher temperature unless you make it like ungodly levels of salt. So yeah, I mean, the commenter in that example is wrong, but you can see how there is a kind of connecting logic there. I think that the trick is just the plugging in the reasoning bit. So there are sort of three possibilities, in my opinion. The one possibility is that the observation and the conclusion don't have a step between them that is reasoning for a lot of people. I think this is true. In other words, to them, there's a kind of set conclusion that observation prompts. And they've sort of learned that that's correct enough that they don't take the step of thinking through the reasoning at that point. They're not thinking focused on the mechanics of why it's happening, just that it's happening, which you can imagine how this could be practical in some situations. But in our modern society, I don't know. I usually maybe not so much. So there's that one possibility. There is no reasoning being done. Possibility number two would be there's reasoning being done, but it's a little too cheap. The person is getting enticed by the idea that they have a reason why they think it's working that way, and therefore they don't insist on further scrutiny that would reveal that, no, that's not why. Usually my examples of this include something like universalizing the idea. If you can make water get hotter that fast, for example, well, steam power generates electricity. So wouldn't we have facilities where we just kind of shovel water, salt into boiling water, and it would make more energy, and then it would create steam power? How marvelous, If you think about the implications of water getting hotter that easily, but you just throwing salt into it, it doesn't seem possible that could be true. And I mean, just logically, like, the salt isn't releasing that much heat energy, like that's just weird the more you think about it. And when you say it that way, it sounds like this commenter is a total idiot. Like, how could you possibly think that that's like adding heat to the water, right? But again, I think it's not so much that they like can't think through that reasoning. It's that they were enticed by the fact that they had some reasoning, because they're not used to reasoning, probably, would be my prediction. A lot of people not insisting on any reasoning at all. Well, if you have some, ooh, like, wow, it must really be true then, because you're not used to the necessary rigor with which, some meaningful truth is obtained. So I wouldn't really think of a person who concluded such a thing as being a total moron for not understanding, obviously, that's not what's going on, as much as they must be distracted by the relative truthiness of the thing. Does that make sense? I think this is a really useful thing to conclude, especially when you communicate with people on the internet. We'll come back to this in a minute. The idea that relative truth can kind of distract people from further scrutiny, which seems weird. It's like they were motivated by logic, and yet they didn't do the very simple further logic that would disprove that conclusion. What, why, how? Like, how is that possible? But it's very possible. I think that's almost the most common misconception people have. And so we'll get into that. But of course, the third one to add in here is what I'm going to call magic thinking, magic reasoning. This is using it takes the form of cause and effect, but isn't real causes. Like, the reasoning can just be essentially any statement, or sometimes it takes the form of because that's how it is, like that's the way it is. Things that are not a reason can be in the reasoning slot and kind of count for some people. It doesn't have to be a thing that is like syntactically logic. It can just be sort of any response. It's like you've given a reason and therefore you did the reasoning, but that's not what that means. What's a good example of magic thinking? Thankfully, I don't think I have too many of these, but yeah, so I guess it would be something like, I mean, the problem is it's hard to even remember these because they're just invalid, and so I've thrown them out of my brain. But it would be something to the effect of, why do we why are we, throwing this water down the drain every morning? And the I don't know, house husband of questionable practices would say, I don't know what this weird family we've made is, would say, that's how it's always been done, or something like that, which, like, that's really not a reason, though it might be calling to, well, it's been being done for so long, therefore there must be a reason. But that in and of itself really isn't a reason. I mean, surely whatever it is doesn't need to be done exactly at this time every day. You're just doing a thing that has been instigated for a long time. Traditions often have a sort of magic thinking explanation. Of course, it's worth noting in the magic thinking category that people often say those things not really like thinking that's the reason. It's more like they know that they won't take the time to actually provide the real reasoning. And so rather than giving no reason, they kind of brush off the need for reasoning a little bit. I don't fully understand why this is. I guess it's just like if you say a reasoning that, like children, for example, this is an often way people deal with children. If you say something that feels like a reason, but that the child won't understand because it's nonsense, then you can kind of get away with not explaining it right now. I guess that's what's happening. I don't know. That's a bit strange. I don't know. I mean, that's weird, but it's just worth acknowledging that people who give reasons that are clearly just nonsensical. That was a bad example. I can't think of any good magic thinking examples. It doesn't mean that they like really think that's why, or that they have no idea why it's really being done. You know what I mean? They may simply have chosen, perhaps inadvisably, not to provide the actual reasoning. Again, I think upon scrutiny, there aren't many compelling reasons to have done that, but I do think it's worth mentioning. It's common that people do that. I'm just not sure that itself makes much sense. Why not just give the reasoning? But people aren't in the habit of this. I don't know. Another big pitfall that will just be a side note here is that people are afraid to attempt reasoning when they don't know for sure what the reason is, which we'll come back to in the good opinions section. So we'll leave that there for a sec. In fact, I'll just write attempting opinion without being certain, which, in short, I think, provided you acknowledge that that's what you're doing, is good. It's much better to attempt the reasoning while acknowledging that you're not sure than to do any of these other things. I'm not convinced there's really any good reason not to provide reasoning, but people will sure give you a lot of reasons for that. Yes, so I wanted to talk a little bit further about this idea of, let's go back to the quote. So an idea that deforms itself into thinking it's a fact, people having opinions like that. What's going on there? I think deforms is some frustration. Bloodborne Hunter, maybe, is what I'm hearing in that quote. Some irritation with people on Bloodborne Twitter that are that won't stop using this type of reasoning or type rhetoric, I guess. But I think it's worth discussing because you see people all the time go through this process where they're not really looking for a reason, a solid reason. They just want something that wins the argument, or it solidifies it, or gives them a good reason to settle on the thing. When people do that thing where they have a reason, but they didn't really push the reason far enough, and I was saying, well, they're not being stupid. It's just because they're not in the habit of having there be reasons for things. But what is the reason to even care about there being a reason for a lot of people? If the reason to care about the reasoning isn't for a reason, that was contrived, but I think that's all sensible. Why? Why then? What is even the point of the reasoning? If there's no reason for the reasoning, why are they looking? Who even cares about reasoning then? Why would it even be relatively influential? And I think the reason is it's a survival thing. It correlates with information that feels reliable. Well, if there's details like that there, what's more likely, that it's correct or that it's an elaborate conspiracy theory? It's more likely that it's correct. And so, yeah, sure, maybe that's an easy way to kind of shortcut. You don't really need to understand. You could just check if there's a reason in there, and then, it's probably right. Of course, if you want to really understand things, you cannot take this shortcut. And I don't think there's actually much of a need to, but that's where it's coming from, I think. And so that's why you often see people do things like there's a commonly held belief, but someone can offer an explanation to the contrary, and that kind of feels like proof, even if the explanation is nonsense or irrelevant or just like blatantly wrong or doesn't really have anything to do with anything. It just feels like, wow, someone had a point about a thing that they organized kind of well. Another example of this phenomenon, if that sounds like that doesn't happen, it totally does, and I'll try to convince you a little more, would be things like on like a Reddit thread or in a YouTube video. If something is very long, it sort of automatically gets the green light from most people. It's got to be very wrong, very obviously wrong for people to look at it and go, oh, no, that's not, a sensible take or whatever. Not a lot really matters in the first place, and so it can just be kind of a long post about whatever in the first place. But a lot of the time, these things are, it's a pretty personal take, which is my polite way of saying it's hopelessly individually biased. But it's very organized, and so people have a tendency to say, well, wow, you put a lot of work in, which doesn't matter. Work is irrelevant. What matters is if you have a good point. If you put a lot of time and effort into it, it sure would be phenomenal if you had a very bad point, despite having spent a lot of time on it, but it's far from impossible to do such a thing. I think what people often overlook is that if you spend a lot of time on something, there comes a point where you want to be right so bad that becomes more important to a lot of people than whether they actually are right. And so a surprisingly large number of long-term projects are surprisingly invalid, even though you'd think surely no one could work on it for that long and have a nonsensical take on the subject. Oh, yes, they could. There's at least one very easy to understand reason why they do that, and it's because they have the sunk cost fallacy popping off in their head. They've worked in it for so long, it would be so much easier if it was just sensible, rather than eventually discovering that it didn't make sense. The solution to all of this is pretty clear and not really the subject of this parlay, but I feel like it's worth briefly mentioning. I mean, you have to want the discovery process instead of the conclusion. People who are doing research for money, well, they'll have no further funding if they don't have, some meaningful conclusion. And so they've been compromised already. It's the same thing as in game design, where if the game has become a very, investment funded public enterprise rather than a thing with the goal to make a fun game, well, it's been compromised. I mean, it might still be a game that has lots of fun features, but that would only be like a nice side effect because the goal is no longer to make something fun. The goal is sort of to have finished the thing, not to have done the thing, to be doing the thing. And so it's perfectly possible to understand things well and not go astray because you're worried that you've put so much time into something, but it's going to go wrong. You simply have to stop being so attached to whether it's wrong or right being the goal. Who cares? You're here to find out. I don't know what the goal of the subject is. And in the first place, you can see this in that a lot of people who embark on these projects kind of have a conclusion they would like to reach going in a bit too much. It's sort of like the goal of the project is to validate that theory. And of course, good science does sometimes involve predicting. I just think that is often a pitfall as well. Probably goes without saying. Anyway, let's briefly turn to the good opinion subject. I just felt like it was worth breaking down for a while since there's no other direction for this parlay. Why do people think such directionless things, like things that seem to have no source or purpose, but they feel them so strongly and they feel like they have kind of proof or really real reasoning for those things, partially because it's relative. They rarely have any reasoning for anything, and so some seems to hold more weight than it should. because their goal isn't to find truth. They're just trying to find things that correlate with something that would be a reliable piece of information. And because it's simply, their goal is to conclude, not to understand. They don't want to know the mechanics behind the thing. They just want the conclusion. Of course, I would word it privately between you and me, dear audience member. They think they want the conclusion instead of the understanding. They think they want that. They don't really want that. They're wrong that they think they want that. But people might think that they want to just know instead of understanding. When in fact, I would argue knowing the thing is essentially worthless. So what? In this one situation, you have a pedantic, technically correct solution instead of knowing something about how things work generally. What good is that? But we won't get into that here. That's definitely a separate topic. Good opinions. Sure. Well, they're probably not things people just made up, ideas that deform themselves into facts. It would probably be something that you went as far as you could in the reasoning step. Observation, there was some reasoning, so hopefully there was reasoning at all, and then you went as far as you could, and then you acknowledge that you just went as far as you could, and you don't know for sure, and then we get to the conclusion stage where you conclude something. I think there's kind of two basic pitfalls with reasoning. The first one is obvious, just insisting that the reasoning is correct. It's perfectly fine to just not feel the need to be an authority. Of course, the reason people do anyway try to be an authority is because they usually back themselves into a situation with their lifestyle that forces them to act like an authority to some extent. If you don't make, for example, a YouTube channel that is based on the process of reasoning or figuring out how things are away, and instead it's just a ton of people that listen to you because you said an authoritative sounding thing, you have to invalidly insist that you have a good point of view, even when you don't, even knowing you don't, because people aren't looking for you to have, a lighter approach to the subject. They're following you because they're looking for the answer, and you're a big figure that would have answers. To put it a different way, if you're popular, it doesn't even have to be that you appealed to people wanting a specific answer. The simple act of being popular turns you into a machine that can provide things that seem to correlate with being true. Like if you say something, well, you're so popular. Isn't it more likely you're just right? And then people will look to you for those things. This is one of the ways in which being famous is automatically bad until proven good, and it's hard to prove good. I've always found that fascinating. It's like a lot of these people have probably realized that, but never really intended to become this like source of monolithic facts from people. But people will look for it even if you don't, go advertising. So, I mean, that one's maybe more obvious, right? Like people don't fail to say, I don't know for sure my opinion is correct. This is just what I think right now, because they want to seem authoritative, or they're kind of forced to want to seem to be authoritative. It isn't actually good to anyone's benefit to do that, whether they think it is or not, but it's understandable why they would feel that way. And then the second reason, maybe a little bit more insidious, it may be simply that it isn't clear that it is just your opinion. It might seem like, well, I really did my due diligence, and it seems like it is just the correct answer. It really isn't just an opinion. It's an idea that there's nothing to tell me it isn't a fact, and so it feels like it is, sort of. Again, I feel like to some extent the previous one debunks this. There's no need to be an authority, so there's never any advantage to insisting that your thing is a fact. Or if you've been put into a situation where you do want to insist that something is a fact, that is a bad situation and is therefore disqualified from this discussion of idealism that doesn't actually apply to anyone. You would ideally want to be in a situation where you don't need to have something be a fact. And so because that's true, even if something seems almost certainly to be true, there's just no need to assert that it's definitely true. It doesn't matter if it appears to be true in every way. There simply remains no advantage to asserting that it's true. But people still do. They still do. And I think part of the reason is that it's convincing to ourselves. Like if you say you think something works a way, it kind of feels like you can rely on that a little bit more. If I don't seem certain of a thing being true, there's almost a way in which I myself kind of can't act on that information, even if I accept that, like, the difference between saying, oh, for all intents and purposes, it's true, but I'm not completely sure, and me saying, oh, it's definitely true. I can think to myself, oh, those are the same. So I'll just act as if it's true, but just keep in mind that it isn't. Either way, I feel like physically we're surprisingly unable to do that. Does that make sense? An example of this would be using a piece of information, like in a game. You gave the example of discussing things in games. You know, if you feel like you can't rely on a mechanic being away, personally, I've often had the experience that I won't rely on that fact or apparent fact, even if I have concluded that there's no reason not to. Like, the best we can do is conclude that that's correct, and so it's irrelevant whether it's true. But I know I don't know for sure that it's true, and for me, that often gives me pause. I sort of can't rely on that thing, or I'll shy away from the, you know, character or whatever in the game. You can imagine this as a bit of a survival instinct too. Like, if you knew that something, you knew that you didn't know for sure that something was safe, I mean, why just eat it unless you were starving, I suppose? You know, you would be more likely to just steer clear of that thing. The very act of acknowledging that you're not certain about the thing adds possibly justified anxiety and hesitation to the subject, which, well, that just feels uncomfortable to people. And so you can understand how, even if it seems like there really is no clear benefit to concluding that the thing is just correct or safe or right or whatever, there's a kind of carrot to it. It would be so much easier if we could just say, oh, but that's just right. If it's so close to being correct, can't we just say it's correct? Like, do we have to have the, you know, extraneous little detail that, we don't know for sure? Really? Do we really have to do that? Can't we just say it's right? I would say no, if we want to have a real meaningful discussion. But you shouldn't, I wouldn't want to act like there's no reason to do that. You shouldn't, if you want to understand people, not acknowledge that there's like a benefit to people feeling certain. This was maybe a hard parlay to follow. Did I coherently express any philosophical idea in this parlay? I feel like I understood what I said, but I'm acknowledging, as I've been talking about this for a half hour, that some of these things maybe weren't easy to convey just with text. And of course they are, well, my opinions about the subject. This is just my best understanding of what is going on when other people conclude things or hold on to feelings that seem to just be nonsense. I feel like a very easy way to summarize this, not the kind of summary that would have been good at the beginning, it would sound ridiculous, but a way to kind of tie up the type of conclusion about people's thinking. When people think something and it just seems crazy, I feel like the very simple explanation is usually rooted back to they need to think that for some reason. There's some need of theirs that is met by oversimplifying the correctness out of that thing. It would be much easier for them to just not need to think about it as much, and so they don't. Thinking through things is a set of privilege. That is an aspect of being privileged, having the time to allow the vulnerability for things to like have reasoning behind them. Though I think that people maybe go a little far in that understandable desire to make things simple. I do think it crosses from you can't add the complexity to no, you could, you're just being lazy and you're not willing to add the complexity. It takes some amount of courage to be willing to allow the complexity into things. You don't really ever get to be right or feel sure of things. And to me, this feels like first grade, but I know a lot of people don't get to that point. And that's okay. But I think it's admirable to try to care about things being true. It's good to want reasons for things because it allows you to share them with people that have good ideas of their own. You'll only ever convince people who have not much to offer otherwise. This was also a pretty cynical parlay, wasn't it? I have been thinking a lot recently about how I often keep myself out of my own videos, and I don't think anybody asked for that. So if you want to ask for that, You can. I may or may not do it, but let me know. But I don't know. Sometimes I think, well, what's the harm, right? I'm not going to put my foot down and say, for sure, I know exactly how everybody thinks about all of their stupid, invalid reasoning, and I have all the answers, and my name's Zandy Pants. Let's do the thing. So if I'm not going to do that, what's the problem with me saying, well, I think, people don't understand the salt not making the water hotter thing because of reasons. You could disagree or have other reasoning. If you don't have other reasoning, I'm not interested in what you have to say about it. And that's why. But actually, even if you do have reasoning, there's a pretty good chance that it's not. But of course, that's the trick. Another topic we could continue on in this vein is how, because there are good reasons, I think, to look for reasoning in people's reasons for things. I've said the word reason enough times that it sounds wrong. You know that phenomenon? Because you're looking for reasoning, there's a kind of reverse option where anything that takes the form of reasoning kind of needs to be filtered if you want to understand the actual reasons for something. Like if I read 10 people's response to why does the salt make the water bubble more, let's say 5 of them, they give a reason that isn't a reason, or they say like that's just what happens when you put salt in water, or somebody will say, oh, it's making it hotter because salt makes water hotter, so it's boiling more, or something like that. There'll be like 5 of those or something, probably more than 5, but whatever. And then 5 of them will take the form of reasoning. They will sound like reasoning, I guess. I don't know. And so by the very same metric that I'm saying, well, I'm just going to discard all the ones that aren't reasoning, I'm not discarding anyone that looks like reasoning, even though I just spent half an hour talking about the many reasons why you would do something that takes the form of reasoning that isn't actually a good reason. And so I'm trapped. I kind of have to go through, the rhetoric of that thing, even if I begin to conclude as I'm thinking through it, like this doesn't seem to be coming from the motivation of trying to understand things. This has happened to me on Twitch a lot. I'll take a few minutes to add a little denouement to this discussion. When I stream on Twitch, you have a lot of power because I talk with chat. If you say something that takes the format of being a reasoned comment, well, I read them and try to respond. That's what I'm doing. So sometimes we get fairly deep into a discussion only for me to sort of get to the person's point and realize, at least from any perspective I can find, that's a pretty absurd, kind of nonsensical point to have gone on. And actually, we were led on a wild goose chase for 15 minutes. I remember a discussion I had the most recent time this happened. Actually, that was pretty interesting, but I don't think it's a useful thought. Was more or less basically the person was talking about the questionable benefits of discussing things at length with people or trying to understand things, pretty much the opposite of this parlay. And eventually they got to the point where their conclusion was, well, you're just going to have no one to talk to if you try to go further with thoughts. And that doesn't really make any sense. Like, first of all, there is the element of I have simply done that and that hasn't been my experience. Even if I didn't have any further reasoning than that, it just mechanically isn't true in a way. For example, in the Adam Ragusea salt into the water experiment, no one is arguing that if you have boiling water and you throw salt into it, the water doesn't bubble. We're only discussing why it's bubbling. Does it get hotter or not? Well, we don't know that for sure. If you didn't measure it with a thermometer, you don't know that for sure. And is it creating nucleation sites? Well, that might require further scrutiny, but no one is arguing that you didn't see that it bubbled up, right? Like that you can't argue that. You did see that. Beyond that, though, we don't know. The same thing here. Like, I have done the thing at least I was describing. Maybe I wasn't clear enough about what I meant in that discussion. And I'm not running out of things to discuss with people in my life. So in that sense, no. I do wonder if someone makes a comment like that. Have you, done a reasoning with people in your life sufficiently that you've, learned whether that will be that way? Another thing is that someone who tries to present a bunch of reasoning to people who insist, for various reasons we've discussed during this parlay, on not focusing on reasoning, well, they would eventually just stop talking to the person. But that has nothing to do with reasoning kind of blocking people from, further discussion. That would just be because those people have a mental hangup that means they can't accept that reasoning right now. That isn't a knock against reasoning. That's a knock against those people. That's okay, but it isn't a reason like not to reason things. That doesn't make sense. We didn't get into that too much here because there's not much to say, but of course it could be people have reached a conclusion, but no one knows all builds. They haven't thought about all the possible reasons why it could be. And from different perspectives, there's actually a pretty obvious explanation that they simply hadn't considered. I think that's maybe the case for that person. Another thing too is it depends on the sort of ground state for philosophy. Maybe, I highly doubt it, but maybe they've talked about this kind of stuff with the people in their life way more than I have. And they've reached some existing kind of final state of philosophical conclusion where you like get to the end of philosophy and there's nothing else to think about. It doesn't seem like that would exist. I feel like why, how, in the same way that if you can go down and down and down through layers of physics, there's a weird way in which once you get to atoms and then quarks and etc., it seems both simultaneously weird that there wouldn't be more stuff further down. Like, how is there a bottom of physics? But then simultaneously, it seems weird that there would be more stuff forever. Like, how can there just be infinite smallernesses, right? That those both seem odd. And really, I think the conclusion there is it seems odd to try to conclude about that. It's so far away from our ability to comprehend things that rather than saying it probably is that there's a bottom of physics or there isn't, it seems safer to say, I'm not sure we would comprehend things beyond that point. And so were we to go so far in our philosophical discussing in this parlay that we stopped discussing for a time, I feel like that would indicate that we'd gone far enough in thinking about these things that I'm not sure we, as we currently are, understand what conclusion had been reached. You know what I mean? Like, it's not right to conclude, oh, well, they stopped talking because there's nothing to say. Or did they ascend to a higher plane of existence and communicate telepathically? You know what I mean? Like, it could just be anything at that point. So it seems wrong to conclude that if we watched humans in a simulation for 1,000 years pacing around in a box, if they stopped talking, we wouldn't go like, they solved philosophy, like they probably went insane or developed ESP, like it's just as likely. It doesn't seem logical to conclude that means we then know for sure that's the end. Like, why? Just because things changed? Like, I don't know. Again, there's a sort of obsession with knowing things in that way of thinking, that my reason for discussing things with people doesn't have to do with what the outcome of discussing those things is. I just want to try to figure through things with you all. I'm not interested in like whether this way of thinking about things that I presented in this parlay will overall benefit people. Well, I am interested in that, but it's not my primary goal. It's sort of worth going on the journey to see what I think anew, maybe prompt thoughts from other people. I don't think that this is a broadly helpful thing to share with people. I feel like people kind of just have to come to this on their own. A very common pitfall is that when this type of thinking is presented, people don't take the proper rigor when implementing it, but hold on to the idea that they've like done it now. They were told how to think in like a philosophically valid way. And so because they've been told how to do that, they can sort of vaguely follow the steps and they feel like they've done it. And so what I've done is kind of given people an out. They can kind of cheat now and feel like they've done it without doing it, which I think is actually sort of worse than if they didn't have that, which is why I don't usually talk about this kind of thing. I think it's sort of worse than not bringing it up. People will kind of come to it organically. So unless you can enforce people not cutting corners, which I don't see how you would do, I guess maybe if you had a mental apprentice somehow, there's some kind of weird, maybe a detective trainee, I don't know, you could kind of police them, taking the easy way out with their thinking, but and I can't with anybody else. So, and the other thing is, I don't want people to falsely assume that I'm more sure of these ways of thinking than I am. I'm not. The entire discussion we just had was about how it's foolish to be, 100% confident in any of these things of whatevering. And of course, it's difficult not to be. There's an incentive to act like you are. I know that. And so you can at least take it at heart that I'm doing whatever I can to resist that bias. And I'm a certain amount capable or not. And I don't know how that'll go. But there's no need to worry that oh no, but he said this, which is like a permanent mental pitfall he'll never get out of. Like, no, no, no. Like, the entire reasoning that I just presented means I would always be willing to interrogate such a thing. There's no possible state of being where a thing becomes kind of immune to being interrogated. And so, therefore, it is kind of not possible to have trapped myself. I just don't, even if things are really true, and then the pitfall is, oh no, now you've concluded forever that nothing can be true, but there are some things that are true. It just isn't functionally different to conclude that they're usually true, but maybe not always. I don't know for sure. That humility isn't going to hurt me. It's okay to just be not sure of things. That's all right. I'm not gonna keel over from that. Though some people might. So it's important to acknowledge that. This was fun. Was this fun? See you next time.